our guest is extraordinary because of all of her accomplishments. She was a Giannini Fellow in 2005, and the 15 years since are really remarkable. And good morning, Jennifer Weisman, to our conversation for the foundation.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
How did you learn about the foundation in the first place, going back to 2005? How did you learn about it, and what were you doing at the moment you applied?
Let's see. This was back during my first year as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, San Francisco. I had just started and was doing research in computational biology and had been looking for different fellowship opportunities for the time that I was going to be a postdoctoral fellow. Um, I honestly had no knowledge of the foundation in advance and had just been scanning and looking for what are different kinds of fellowships that I could apply for my research, which at the time was on computational modeling around malaria for drug discovery. And I had just stumbled across this. Thank you, internet. Provider of information. I had literally just stumbled across this and read a little bit more about the medical research fellowship, and I'm like, wow, that's pretty fantastic. And that was my introduction to it.
What's your memory of the experience of applying and the interview at Pebble? What do you remember about that experience?
Oh wow, this was what felt like my first real interview. Coming from uh, directly from grad school, I'd done the kinds of one-on-one types of interviews before, but I'd never had to get up in front of an entire panel. I remember preparing quite a lot. It was a actually very instructive and educational process because I had good ideas, I thought, around the research that I was doing, but being able to convey that succinctly, clearly, to really communicate the importance of the work to an audience of very smart, intelligent people that were not necessarily well versed in my specific area of science. That was the first time that I had to do that, and I think it was incredibly instructive on how I've thought about the importance of science communication from there on out. I practiced on various friends who were not scientists to make sure that I was really hitting the high points of like why this is important, why should anyone care about this research, and how is this actually going to make an impact. And that's something that I've taken with me in all steps of my career afterwards. And I think that was, yeah, it was an amazing experience. And then the actual going to Pebble Beach, doing the interview in that beautiful setting, it was a good crash course in prepping me for my future career path.
One of the things that I'm charged with is helping the fellows develop some communication skills. Most of them, I tell them at the very beginning, very little of what I'm going to say is something you haven't experienced, observed, or already know. So you can minimize the wisdom that may come from me because it's rarely going to happen. But what does strike me is the importance of communications. And when you look at your role in so many different arenas, do you think that the research and the scientific and medical communities undervalue uh, science communications, or they just don't have the time or take the time to focus on it?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think that we're in a very interesting time right now. This is actually part of what had drawn me after my postdoctoral fellowship and the Giannini fellowship. That's part of what had drawn me to the science policy fellowship that I did in DC afterwards. I think that I think historically, We haven't needed as scientists to worry as much on an individual level about how we're communicating our science to the broader public. And it's, during the course of my degree, it's certainly not something that I was trained in, and I haven't seen that incorporated into curricula for graduate students in any kind of intentional way, more globally. I think that now the state that we're in now, where information is so easily shared, everyone can have their own platform from their home to share whatever they'd like. It's really really a major need at this point to be able to communicate, to be able to have that voice. And so I certainly hope that there will be more attention going forward in this. And as I was saying, this is something that had drawn me to the Science Policy Fellowship that I did in DC. Um, and there were definitely elements in that work about how you communicate science in different settings, of course, within the U.S. government. But I think it's absolutely critical.
What are some of the links between the fellowship 2005, 2006 in that time? But then how did you get to DC? How did that actually happen?
Yeah, this was actually at the same time during my first year as a postdoc when I was looking for fellowships and ended up applying for the Giannini Foundation Fellowship. I had also at that point stumbled across the AAAS, uh, that's the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I had stumbled across their Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. And I had never previously thought about, frankly, anything other than an academic career path as the, traditional route that you go in grad school. I think most of us go in thinking that we're heading down the academic route, looking for professor positions on the other side, maybe after a postdoc. So that's always what I'd had in my head. And it was, again, just something I stumbled across. I saw this and I thought, science policy. I don't know anything about that. It sounds kind of intriguing. I'm just going to file that one away in the back of my head for later. And it's, over the course of the next few years, I was in my postdoc for 4 years. And during the time that I was there, it's something that just sort of kept, bubbling up in the back of my head that I thought, that sounds intriguing. The idea of being able to use a scientific and very quantitative background to help influence science policy, that sounds pretty inspiring. And so it was something that sort of grew over the time that I was there, and I thought, you know what, it's worthwhile exploring it, and given what I felt like were my interests, strengths, that it was likely something that would be a good fit to
Hmm.
try to pursue.
We have a question from Kristen Perrins, and she was a fellow in 2019, and she's curious how researchers can get involved in science policy in a larger context. I mean, you're in your lab, you're in your facility, you have your own lab perhaps, and yet science policy it's out there. So what recommendations, what insight do you have for people how they can get involved in science policy as
Yeah,
well?
yeah, yeah. So that's a great question, and I think that science policy has, I mean, it's a pretty broad and all-encompassing word. So that's definitely something that I learned when I went to DC. Before going into the U.S. government, I spent a few months at the National Academies, doing a smaller science policy fellowship. And I think that's one very tangible, real way that that is accessible from your laboratory is involvement in different kinds of studies and activities that the National Academies runs, where they need subject matter experts all the time on all different kinds of studies that they perform. I I think that you can think about science policy also in the U.S. government lens, also in the home lens, right? There's, I think, a lot of ways that you can influence policy from your personal vantage point where you are. For example, something that I am fairly involved with at the Gates Foundation is our open access policy for publishing. So that's something that's very relevant, very real time right now. There's a lot of activity trying to move towards making sure the research that we fund, that others fund, are available to all of the communities as soon as possible to help speed science, to help make sure there's equitable access to researchers across the globe. So that's one example of an area of science policy where absolutely there's a lot that can be done at the level of academic institutions. And I think there are many other kinds of examples like that, really depending on what it is that you're passionate about and have expertise
Hmm. I'm curious, something else that intrigues me is not only are many of these researchers looking at something very specific, narrow, if you will, although it can lead to significant other discoveries. But when you think about it, they're in a lab, they're in a cohort, a community. We can narrow our focus. What you're saying to me is that widen that focus, however you do it, whether it's the AAAS, whether there are other organizations that you can join as a scientist that open up the lines of communications and the opportunities. Don't stay too close, too narrow. Open it up by thinking more broadly. Is that something that you would advocate?
Yes, although I think that it's really important to have that as a researcher and a scientist to have that deep content expert lens, right? So this is where you're going to have the most power for your voice is your personal um, experience in something, but then using that to apply it to something that you care about that has that broader impact.
Ebony Flowers is a 2020 fellow, so we're just starting to work with her now. She's curious the technical skills. What do you need to have? How do you acquire certain skills that may not be in the typical way of going about learning stuff? What technical skills would you think would be helpful in research and in the science policy area?
In the science policy area. Well, I right. So I was not formally trained in anything science policy related. This fellowship was a is a 2 year um, 2 year fellowship in DC that was specifically designed to take scientists and medical doctors, place them in different offices within the U.S. government across different agencies. I spent a year at NIH and a year at the Department of Health and Human Services. Um, and the whole point of this program is to infuse the U.S. government with um, more individuals with that scientific, rigorous background and thinking and expertise. It was really just a one of those experiences where you're thrown in and sink or swim kind of thing. I think for me it was a fantastic experience. One, because I really enjoy new environments and having to learn fast, right? Surrounding yourself with people who are experts and know more than you about whatever new topic, and just diving in and trying to learn as quickly as possible, learn and adapt as quickly as possible. I think that, we've talked about this already, but communication is a pretty critical skill. That's verbally written communication is, I think, one of the most invaluable skills that you can develop in your scientific career, but really try to hone beyond technical writing into how do you translate something into a one pager that's going to appeal to people who don't have your exact background. That kind of development, regardless of the path that you choose going forward, whether it's policy, whether it's staying in science in an academic position, or industry. I think being able to communicate the importance of your work clearly, concisely, is invaluable. I think, especially in this very fascinating world that we're in right now, in this remote environment where there's information deluge from everywhere, right? Everyone's emails are inundated, we're on camera all the time. Being able to make your point, convey what you really care about, and influence the decisions that others may be able to make is incredibly important.
It's not what you want to say necessarily, but it is what you want people to remember. And just having that lens, because we talk a lot about people can go on and on and on, and the slides go on, they're not legible, et cetera. So focusing on what you really want
Yeah,
people to remember. We
yeah.
also work a lot on understanding about that work-life balance. And so Ebony asks, what are your personal challenges at the Gates Foundation? In terms of your life and your work and the logistics, et cetera. What are some of those challenges for you?
Yeah, so I mean, there's pre-COVID, and then there's the reality of the the our day to day that's now. I think, um, yeah, work-life balance is definitely something that I've always struggled with. I Especially now in the work from home environment, I am incredibly grateful, very thankful that I am in a position where, you know, most of the work that I do can be done very effectively remotely. I think we're learning fascinating things about how we can all work remotely, and especially in a role and in a place like the Gates Foundation, where we're primarily grant makers and influencers. That is absolutely very conducive to working remotely and doing video and written communication. It's easy for the days to just completely bleed on the early and on the later end as well, being in your home environment, just spending a little bit of time more. You can just walk back to your computer. It's just, there's something psychologically very different, that it feels like you could just be on all the time, around the clock. And so for me, and I try to counsel this to my team, to our division as well. I mean, it's really important to set some boundaries. I mean, especially now at the foundation, we are working on COVID, so there's a lot of drive, a lot of passion. People feel a lot of time pressure on the work, but burnout is a real thing, right? And I think we're all seeing that this is really more the marathon at this point. So, for me, doing things like, I have to get a workout in every morning, right? So that's like one of my stress management tools, is making sure that I'm getting that workout every day, that I am stopping by a certain hour and getting a walk outside, making sure I'm taking time to have dinner with my family. These are the things, and then making sure I'm actually trying to take time off on the weekends to recharge, go outside, be out in the mountains somewhere. Um, these kinds of things. I mean, I think you just have to be realistic with setting boundaries that you can't be on all the time and expect that you're going to be a high performer, and in a sustainable way.
We talk about sustainability a lot, and it's true sustaining your own life and your energy and your enthusiasm, your passion, etc. Eliza Zhang is a fellow from, I think, 2018. And she says, I know maternal health is an area of focus for the Gates Foundation. What new programs or innovations have been most successful in combating maternal deaths worldwide? Do you have any insight into that?
Oh wow, there's lots that we could chat on there, and actually, I welcome. I'm sorry, you said that was Elijah. Actually, if that's something that you'd like to find out more about, I'd be delighted to connect you with some folks in the foundation. So we've got dedicated teams that work on both the sort of upstream new R&D kinds of approaches to maternal and neonatal child health, also downstream delivery. Um, gosh, I don't want to go through the list, but this is something that we're very interested in and put quite a lot of resources on. There's fascinating work on nutrition. There's really interesting work in um, having access to care, different kinds of strategies to engage women when they are expecting on their care, in advance, and afterwards. So lots of interest there.
Do you mind if Eliza connects with you? Maybe you can turn her in a direction where
Great.
she can learn
Happy to.
more. She's
Yeah.
at Stanford doing some extraordinary work in this area. And it's one of the other things about this period of time with COVID. It underscores and puts a spotlight on disparity in so many different issues. And pregnancy and maternal health is one of them, not only in this country, but globally as well. Um, Nicole Rolls is the publisher of our Giannini, kind of the new Giannini newsletter. And she asks, could you talk a little bit more about what you did at NIH and the Department of HHS and the Pentagon, for gosh sakes? Give us a little more insight into what the reality of those experiences were, some of the highlights.
Sure. So I was at NIH a couple of times. First as a fellow, and then later after my fellowship, I got hired back on there. And interspersed was HHS. So a couple of highlights. When I worked at NIH, I was in the immediate office of the director, so supporting the principal deputy. That's uh, Francis Collins's second in command. In that role, I spent some time working on issues related to data and how we thought about data use at the NIH. I spent a lot of time working on basically trans NIH policy initiatives. So this is a part of the stint in DC and the fellowship where it really felt like policy. Um, various kinds of activities supporting the advisory committee to the director, and I really got the sort of first dry run experience of what a chief of staff type role is, which is frequently a catcher of all kinds of random things that need to get done. Fires that need to be put out, responses to congressional inquiries, data requests on grants, how much we're funding in certain areas, like across the board, those kinds of things. At HHS, I was, as a fellow in the Personalized Medicine Initiative. This was when the time when the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act was actually signed into legislation. and the Office for Civil Rights was tasked with turning that legislation into regulation. So I started out as a fellow and then was hired on as a federal employee to be literally the scientist in the office, to help the lawyers with crafting the regulations. And they wanted someone to be in house that really understood the terminology well to help them build out regulation that the agencies would need to enact with respect to genetic information on discrimination. So that again, that was a heavy policy stint. It was a introduction to me and how you create regulations, how laws become regulation, and it was a really interesting time. It was a lot of collaboration across the different agencies within HHS, so NIH, FDA, um, Office for Human Research Protections, all were involved in really negotiating the language, and what that would mean in terms of protection of human subjects in in employment situations and in research, science research situations. Now, the time that I spent at DARPA and DoD, quite different. DARPA was much more program management kind of work. So DARPA is a funding agency. I was working on a program that was designed to, the goal was to outpace the spread of infectious disease. So we funded academics and industry partners to develop new diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, actually quite similar to the kinds of work that I am involved in at the foundation. And and that was from the lens of, helping to manage a technical team of scientific experts to make decisions about funding. And then finally, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon work, was much more of a think tank kind of environment. I was working in the Office of Net Assessment and looking at the implications of biotechnology on our national security horizon in the sort of 30-year future outlook. So quite a range of different things, and all of those I think you could probably put under the science policy label. So, which is what I was saying earlier, it can mean quite a lot of different things. People use the term very broadly, um, and I think I got to experience quite a lot of those different different aspects.
It's amazing. Sometimes people will say, they may ask somebody, "Tell me what you do." "I did this, I did that, I did that." And they say, "Well, pick one." You picked or got thrown into some situations, a lot of on-the-job experience, I'm assuming here, that you did not necessarily academically bring into these positions?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's the one sort of major tying in force. I mean, I'm classically trained as a quantum computational chemist, so I'm definitely not bringing that quantum chemistry expertise into each of these roles. I think more than anything, it's the analytical mindset, the ability to think deeply and ask important questions, and then the appetite to learn. Right. So that's been the driving theme, and each time that I've moved, from my degree to my postdoc to the policy fellowship, and each of these, it's just being interested and enthusiastic to learn quite a lot and pick up and run as quickly as possible. And that's really had been a main part of the decision process for me when I decided to pursue the policy fellowship just from thinking about what I find personally motivating and interesting. I I felt that my skill sets were better suited to being able to move across a lot of different areas of science at that more shallow level rather than do the super deep dive in a narrow level. And to me, I love science. I find everything interesting basically on some level. So policy, science policy, that broad lens seemed like a really good fit for me to be able to move quickly between lots of different topics and to be able to continuously learn.
Tell us a little more about what you're doing now at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. What's your role?
At the Gates Foundation, I am director of the Office of the President and Chief of Staff in the Global Health Division. Um, and it's a fascinating place to be where I feel like all the steps of my career that I just walked through finally make sense in totality. That actually the program management, the policy work, the human subjects protections work, biosecurity and infectious disease, they all tie together in the work that we do in the foundation. So the Global Health Division at the Gates Foundation is really the upstream R&D part of the foundation, where we work on developing new interventions to reduce mortality and morbidity in the parts of the world where there is the most need. Um, so we again develop diagnostics, um, therapeutics, vaccines, different kinds of interventions to help protect the most vulnerable communities. And my role as chief of staff um, sort of it bridges aspects of our overarching strategy for the global health division and also more operations. So this role definitely has more of an operational efficiency element to it, where I deal a lot with ensuring that our workforce is optimal for the kinds of problems that we want to solve, that we have really effective communication, again communication internally, actually, in this case, between the president of the division and all of the teams between the divisions, to make sure that we are as um, efficient and high functioning as possible. I'm also, as the director of the Office of the President, I manage a team of individuals that support things like how we prioritize the use of voice for our president, right? So making sure that um, we are engaging the president in activities that are going to be incredibly game changing for the things that we want to accomplish. So using that lens to try to triage and prioritize how and where he shows up. I also manage a team of fellows. We have a fellowship program at the foundation, which is unfortunately on hold right now, but we still have fellows that were brought in, hired in a couple of years ago. So we have a team of fellows that reports to me as well, and I manage them across the division. They do discrete projects with different teams, and um, yeah, that's about it. And most of my role really is, I would say, a facilitator role, trying to help make sure everyone else can work as effectively as possible.
So, all of those things, all of the people that you're engaged with, all of the complexities of their work and your work, it comes down to you're facilitating all of these things happen in a hopeful and pragmatic and practical and amazing way. Um, Quick question. If you were one of our fellows online right now and then watching this on YouTube, what is it that you might have hoped someone would have said to you during this process? Something that really, sometimes when people give you advice, there's a moment when you're ready for that and a moment when you're not ready for it, but the advice is still sound. What advice would you give to our fellows who are watching you right now about their life and careers?
The thing that I have found um, that really makes the most difference in the day to day is the people that you're surrounded by and the actual tasks and what you need to accomplish, and how you can be effective in your own role. I think that that's it's an interesting question about what I would have wanted to know, um, maybe in your position and making that decision to go into policy instead of staying on a scientific track. I think that it's for me, personal choice. It was a good one. It's definitely something that I would, if anybody is thinking about that, would counsel you to think really hard about it at this stage. It's, I think, easy to move into policy at any stage of your career. It's much harder to move back into being the deep content technical expert. So if there's any question in your mind about like, oh, I'm not sure, maybe I wouldn't jump to policy right away, because there are plenty of ways that you can be effective from your vantage point of being the technical expert. So it's really, just understanding what you love to do on a day-to-day basis.
What surprises you about this whole journey? This is a very interesting conversation, and you are a very interesting person. We talk with a lot of people who kind of are on a path and don't vary that path very much. They may go to a different lab or a different academic setting, but the path is pretty stable. They're doing research, they want their own lab, and they realize that that process is about raising money and it's about hiring and firing people, but it's running a small business, but in the context of scientific research. Your path has been really interesting. So, what surprised you along the way?
What did surprise me was that at some point I just said, maybe that's okay if I don't actually know the end goal, as long as I am interested and engaged and learning new things at every step along the way. Maybe that's actually what my straight and direct path is. And I just need to think about it. Think about a different parameter space on what I'm measuring in terms of direction. And once I started thinking about it that way, like, oh, this actually does make a lot of sense. It doesn't look linear from the outside, but it makes a lot of sense to me.
People looking for work, looking for fellowships, and I'm broadening this into a huge spectrum of people who are looking to move forward with their lives. What's your experience? What's your insight? And what advice would you offer for people to stand out? One of my daughters was looking for a job and she would send the application, and like a millisecond later, the rejection happened. Now, nobody was looking at this resume in any kind of detailed way, but it was like whatever the algorithms were, whatever the words, the response was immediate. How do people stand out in this world today and in this kind of work? What's your advice?
I have always been pretty shameless at emailing people and asking for help. When I was prepping for and really just thinking about the National Academies Fellowship and also the AAAS Fellowship, did a lot of research looking at who the different individual people who were involved and could potentially be interested in hosting fellows. And I just sent emails to them directly saying, "Hi, this is me, this is my experience. I'm really interested in XYZ. And would you have any advice for me, or would you be willing to chat?" I think that, tapping into um, building out a network as much as possible is incredibly valuable. And all along the way, fellowships are not, as I've been thinking about, especially earlier on when I was thinking about different career paths, I did a ton of informational interviews. So this is just reaching out to people saying, I'm really interested in your career path and how you got to be where you are. Would you be willing to chat with me for a few minutes? And I find that most people, when asked in that way, when not being asked about a specific job, when they're just asked to chat about themselves, are usually pretty responsive and open to saying, "Sure, I'm happy to tell you about how I got to be here," and just leave it at that. And those, I mean, generally, when left in that kind of open-ended way, they're incredibly interesting, right? Understanding how people made their own decisions is super fascinating, but also ends up helping out in more cases than not. That person is usually then willing to say, "Oh, I may not be able to help you on this, but I know this other person who I think you should chat with," and you sort of build out your network that way.
I think that's brilliant, and it's exactly how I started in radio. You get people to, no, we don't have anything, but down the street there's somebody, and let me recommend or whatever. It was incredibly helpful. I want to leave you with one last question, and I do not emphasize, do not want to put words in your mouth. Are you okay so far? Okay. The Giannini Foundation, as you look back, was there an impact? Is there something that you can look at that says that was an important step in my life and in my career?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. I mean, beyond the experience, I mean, the fact of having that fellowship gave me an additional um, few years to actually do the research that I did as a postdoc in malaria drug discovery, which was really interesting and helped, I think, to develop me as a strong technical expert in a specific area. I think beyond that, and what we talked about earlier, the whole interview process really set me on a path of thinking about how I approach and communicate science. And it really crystallized it for me. And I absolutely think it was pivotal in developing me as a scientist and a communicator.